Hello, and welcome to Session 2 of our series on nitrogen. I'm Matt Montgomery, Sales Agronomist with Burris Seeds. Now, as we tend to do whenever we do a multi-session series, I'd encourage you to go back to Session 1 if you've not watched it already. It will really lay the groundwork for understanding what we're going to talk about here today. Today's subject is really the nitrogen cycle. And we really left off last time talking about the importance of nitrogen. We talked about two ways that nitrogen is important because of negative things, and this was one of them. We mentioned that nitrogen is incredibly important to the plant, but that it also can become deficient rather easily, and this can result in malformed ears, this can result in some yellowing on the plant, it can result in yield loss. The second slide that we closed up with last time was this one right here, nitrogen and the environment. We talked about how nitrogen can be transformed into a form that is easily lost. And that can be easily lost either into the air or sometimes I should say, into water. There's real concerns about down in the Gulf of Mexico, something we call hypoxia, a low oxygen environment that somewhat is caused by nitrogen and phosphorus. And there are concerns in drinking water when nitrate levels get too high. The point here again is that nitrogen is an incredibly important nutrient for raising a crop, and we have to manage it carefully because it also can have those negative environmental consequences. I should mention this really reiterates why the nitrogen cycle, and at least becoming familiar with it, is pretty important. So this is the nitrogen cycle. I should say a simplified version of the nitrogen cycle. I've actually presented on this topic before during my past career with University Extension, and we had a little bit more complicated graph that we worked with. We really don't need to go into all the nuances of the nitrogen cycle. This simplified diagram will work for our purpose today. I will stress though, it is a cycle. Nitrogen comes into the soil environment and it leaves the soil environment, and it uses this pathway to do so. So let's start here. Let's talk about how nitrogen comes in, and then we'll talk about how nitrogen goes out. Nitrogen comes into the soil environment in one of three ways. It comes in through fixation. We'll talk about what that is. It comes in through mineralization, and we might put this in quotation marks because mineralization really isn't necessarily at entering the soil environment. It's already kind of there. It's just being released into a plant available form. And then, of course, there's the application of fertilizer. Here I said ammonium, eventual ammonium from fertilizer that is applied. So let's start out by talking about fixation. Okay, we'll talk about mineralization, we'll talk about fertilizer. We have the example of our anhydrous tanks here on the bottom of the screen. But let's start out by talking about fixation. Fixation is taking nitrogen out of the air and sticking it in the ground, naturally, I guess I would say. Now remember, the air around you is absolutely inundated with nitrogen. There's more nitrogen there than there is oxygen. But to get it out of the air, to break the chemical bonds of nitrogen floating around in the air, requires tons of energy. And a lightning bolt is a great example of how much energy. The energy of a lightning bolt is the kind of energy needed to sever those bonds and get nitrogen into the soil. Now, something else that also requires a lot of energy, another way that we go from the air into the ground, is nodules. Is natural fixation by bacteria in the soil. And that doesn't sound like a high energy requirement, but remember, those bacteria that form nodules, like those in the picture in the center part of the screen right here, they require tons of energy, and what they're using is sugar. Sugar, remember, is the chemical storage battery. It's taking energy from sunlight and it's cramming it into this chemical storage battery that we call sugar. There's a lot of energy wrapped up there, and bacteria use that energy to fix nitrogen. That's how much energy is required, and that's fixation. So on fixation, when we're talking about nitrogen-fixing bacteria, when we're talking about legumes that can, through this relationship that they have with bacteria, pull nitrogen out of the air and get it into the ground, we really don't have to worry about fertilizer. But some of the other crops we do. Things like corn, for instance, are going to require, and wheat, lots of nitrogen fertilizer to produce a crop. Let's move on from there, though, and let's talk about the next topic. We talked about fixation. Let's talk about mineralization. We have nitrogen tied up in plant parts, and that nitrogen, as things begin to degrade, is released. That's what we call mineralization. A great example here, this is actually a slide from a presentation we did back during my extension career in 2006 when we had a soil and water workshop. And this is just an example of how quickly the nitrogen in organic material breaks down, is released. You can see year one, for instance, you have maybe 25 to 30% of the nitrogen, maybe, there are a lot of different factors that roll in here, in manure being released for the crop to use. Okay? Year two, we have a little bit more. Year three, we have a little bit more. Year four, we have a little bit more. You have the slow release, almost like a natural slow release fertilizer, when you have organic materials that are degrading and releasing that nitrogen into the soil. That's mineralization. Now let's talk about fertilizer applications. So we're talking about things like anhydrous, 28, 32, urea, all these synthetically derived materials that we actually get into the ground and get nitrogen into the ground, I guess you would say artificially. It's really benefited the crop tremendously, hasn't it? It's really the advent of not just hybrid seed corn, but also fertilizer, modern fertilizer that has helped us produce the crop that we produce. Nitrogen's a great example of this, and we use a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. Now, I'm not going to get in depth right now about correct nitrogen rates, but I do want to mention in passing that when we talk about getting nitrogen into the ground, one of those get it into the ground portions of the nitrogen cycle, really we've talked a lot here for a while now of guiding growers toward what we call the MRTN calculator. This is the website from Iowa State University, one of the land-grant universities that actually houses, that actually sponsors this calculator. And it really looks at return on nitrogen investment. It looks at the price of corn, the price of nitrogen, and it helps you figure out what the right rate would be for you when it comes to nitrogen. I'd encourage you, as you think about the way that we actually introduce nitrogen into the soil artificially, to use this so that we decrease those negative consequences we talked about at the beginning of this session. Now, what follows here is really a primer for what we're going to talk about later on. I want to talk about ways that nitrogen is pulled out of the nitrogen cycle. We have something called immobilization, we have denitrification, and then we also have leaching, which is kind of depicted by the downward arrow in the picture right here. So let's talk about each one of these pathways through which nitrogen is lost from the cycle. One of those is immobilization, and the best example I could think of immobilization is nitrogen being drawn up into the crop. And you can see that in the picture right here. We have the lush green leaves from 2014 crop production, lots of nitrogen in there, making up chlorophyll molecules, but it's no longer in the soil because of that. It's no longer in the soil available for the plant to use. It's already in the plant. We have examples of nitrogen being taken up by microorganisms, tied up within the bodies of microorganisms, no longer available to the crop. That's immobilization. Nitrogen being pulled out of the soil environment by being taken up into living organisms, and then it's kind of stalled out there because we have to wait for those organisms to decompose to release that nitrogen through mineralization. We also have leaching. Leaching, I kind of think of that as the picture up in the upper right-hand corner here of the screen. That actually is a picture of center pivot irrigation in the state of Illinois, but it tends to correspond to where we have coarser soil types. Nitrogen can be converted into a lost form, an easily lost form, And these places where we have center pivot irrigation tend to be the coarser, sandier soil types, great big pore spaces that let water flow through. If nitrogen is going to go into groundwater, it tends to happen in these areas. It can come out through tile outlets and all those kind of things. But if you're going to see a lot of leaching, it tends to happen on these coarser soil types. And then we have denitrification. When a soil becomes waterlogged for a period of time, bacteria become active on that nitrogen and they convert it into a form that can be easily lost. It's one of the places that leachable nitrogen comes from. It also can transform once again, and this happens more often, into a gas that can be lost into the air, like N2 gas. It can become a greenhouse gas, basically. What I think we want to draw away from this is we really want there to be more weight on the side of the nitrogen cycle where we're applying and maintaining that nitrogen. We don't want to have this situation where we lose a lot of that nitrogen. We want to increase our efficiency. Maintain what we have, don't lose it. And there are some practical steps we can go through to minimize nitrogen loss. Well, that's session 2. I hope that it was enjoyable, that you gained a lot from it, and we'll talk to you in session 3.